Hello, and thank you for joining me in Annie Stories. In this clip, I'll be reading W.H.D. Rouse's edited version of The Enchanted Horse. So without further ado, let us continue our journey of Arabian tales. The Enchanted Horse. The first day of the year is observed throughout Persia as a solemn festival. Upon that day, rejoicings are held, and strangers are encouraged to come from neighboring states and most remote parts of the world, and are allowed to compete for large rewards, being invited to display to the sovereign the various inventions and contrivances they have brought with them. Upon one of these festivals, after the most ingenious artists of the country had repaired to the court of Shiraz, had been entertained there by the king, and had been bountifully rewarded for their various productions, just as the assembly was about to break up, a Hindu appeared at the foot of the throne. He had with him an artificial horse, richly caparisoned, and so naturally imitated that at first sight he was taken for a living animal. The Hindu prostrated himself before the throne, and pointing to the horse, said to the emperor, "Though I present myself the last before your majesty, yet I can assure you that nothing shown today is so wonderful as this horse, on which I beg your majesty would be pleased to cast your eyes." "I see nothing more in the horse," replied the emperor, "than the natural resemblance the workman has given him, which the skill of another workman may possibly execute as well or better." "Sir," replied the Hindu, "it is not for his outward form and appearance that I recommend my horse to your majesty's examination as wonderful, but the use to which I can apply him, and which, when I have communicated the secret to them, any other persons may make of him. Whenever I mount him, be it where it may, if I wish to transport myself through the air to the most distant part of the world, I can do it in a very short time. This, sir, is the wonder of my horse, a wonder which nobody ever heard speak of, and which I offer to show your majesty if you command me." Notwithstanding the many prodigies of art the emperor had seen, he had never before beheld or heard of anything that came up to this. He told the Hindu that unless he saw him perform what he had promised, he could not bring himself to believe in the truth of it. The Hindu instantly put his foot into the stirrup, mounted the horse with admirable agility, and when he was seated in the saddle, asked the emperor whither he would be pleased to command him to proceed. About 3 leagues from Shiraz there was a lofty mountain, discernible from the large square before the palace, where the emperor, his court, and a great concourse of people then were. "Do you see that mountain?" said the emperor, pointing to it. "It is not a great distance from hence, but it is far enough to judge of the speed you can make in going and returning. But because the eye cannot follow you so far, as a proof that you have been there, I expect that you will bring me a branch of a palm tree that grows at the bottom of the hill." No sooner had the emperor spoken than the Hindu turned a peg which was in the hollow of the horse's neck, just by the pommel of the saddle, and in an instant the horse rose off the ground and carried his rider into the air with the rapidity of lightning, to such a height that those who had the strongest sight could not discern him. Within less than a quarter of an hour, they saw him returning with a palm branch in his hand. But before he descended, he took 2 or 3 turns in the air, and then alighted on the spot whence he had set off, without receiving the least shock from the horse to disorder him. He dismounted, and, going up to the throne, prostrated himself, and laid the branch of the palm tree at the feet of the emperor. The emperor, who had viewed this extraordinary sight with admiration as well as astonishment, conceived a great desire to have the horse, and thought he would have little difficulty in treating with the Hindu. Judging of the horse by his outward appearance, said he to the Hindu, "I did not think him so much worth my consideration. As you have showed me his merits, I am obliged to you for undeceiving me, and to prove to you how much I esteem it, I will purchase him of you, if he is to be sold." "Sir," replied the Hindu, "I never doubted your Majesty, who has the character of the most liberal prince on earth, would set a just value on my work as soon as I had shown you on what account he was worthy your attention. I also foresaw that you would not only admire and commend it, but you would desire to have it, though I know his intrinsic value, and that my continuing master of him would render my name immortal in the world. Yet I am not so fond of fame, but I can resign him to gratify your Majesty. However, in making this declaration, I have another to add, without which I cannot resolve to part with him, and perhaps you may not approve of it. I did not buy this horse, but obtained him from the inventor by giving him my only daughter in marriage, and promising at the same time never to sell him, but if I parted with him, to exchange him for something that I should value beyond all else." "I am willing," said the emperor, "to give you whatever you may ask in exchange. My kingdom is large and contains great riches. I will give you the choice of what you like best." This offer seemed royal and noble to the whole court, but was much below what the Hindu had in his mind. "I am infinitely obliged to your Majesty," he said, "and cannot sufficiently thank you for your generosity. Yet I must beg of you not to be displeased if I have the presumption to tell you I cannot resign my horse unless I receive the hand of the princess, your daughter, as my wife." The courtiers could not forbear laughing aloud at this extravagant demand of the Hindu, but the Prince Firoz Shah, the eldest son of the emperor and heir to the crown, was most indignant. The emperor, however, was inclined to think he might sacrifice the Princess of Persia, so anxious was he to possess the horse. Prince Firoz Shah, who saw his father hesitating what answer to make, began to fear lest he should comply with the Hindu's demand. Therefore, to anticipate him, he said, "I hope your Majesty will forgive me for asking, if it is possible your Majesty should hesitate about a denial to so insolent a demand from such an insignificant fellow. I beg you to consider what you owe to yourself, to your own blood, and the high rank of your ancestors." "Son," replied the emperor, "I much approve of your remonstrance, and am sensible of your zeal for preserving the luster of your birth, but you do not consider sufficiently the excellence of this horse, nor that the Hindu, if I should refuse him, may make the offer somewhere else, where this nice point of honor may be waived. I shall be in the utmost despair if another prince should boast of having exceeded me in generosity, and deprived me of the glory of possessing what I esteemed as the most singular and wonderful thing in the world. I will not say I cannot consent to grant him what he asked. Perhaps he has not well considered his exorbitant demand, and, putting my daughter the princess out of the question, I may make another agreement with him that will answer his purpose as well. But before I conclude the bargain with him, I should be glad that you would examine the horse, try him yourself, and give me your opinion." The Hindu fancied from what he had heard that the emperor was not entirely averse to his alliance, and that the prince might become more favorable to him. Therefore, he expressed much joy, ran before the prince to help him to mount, and showed him how to guide and manage the horse. The prince mounted, however, without the Hindu's assistance, and no sooner had he put his feet in both stirrups, but without staying for the owner's advice, he turned the peg he had seen him use, when instantly the horse darted into the air, quick as an arrow shot from a bow by the most adroit archer. And in a few moments the emperor, his father, and the numerous assembly lost sight of him. Neither horse nor prince were to be seen. The Hindu, alarmed at what had happened, prostrated himself before the throne and said, "Your Majesty must have remarked the prince was so hasty that he would not permit me to give him the necessary instructions to govern my horse. Therefore, the favor I ask of your Majesty is not to make me accountable for what accidents may befall him." The emperor was much surprised and afflicted, and asked the Hindu if there was no secret to bring him back, other than by which he had been carried away. "Sir," replied the Hindu, "there is room to hope that the prince, when he finds himself at a loss, will perceive another peg, and as soon as he turns that, the horse will cease to rise and descend to the ground, when he may turn him to what place he pleases by guiding him with the bridle." Notwithstanding all these arguments of the Hindu, which carried great appearance of probability, the Emperor of Persia was much alarmed at the evident danger of his son. "I suppose," replied he, "it is very uncertain whether my son may perceive the other peg, and make a right use of it. May not the horse, instead of alighting on the ground, fall upon some rock, or tumble into the sea with him?" "Sir," answered the Hindu, "I can deliver your Majesty from this apprehension by assuring you that the horse crosses seas without ever falling into them, and always carries his rider wherever he may wish to go. And your Majesty may be assured yourself that if the prince does not find the other peg I mentioned, the horse will carry him where he pleases. It is not to be supposed that he will stop anywhere, but where he can find assistance and make himself known." "Be as it may," replied the Emperor of Persia, "I cannot depend upon the assurance you give me. Your head shall answer for my son's life if he does not return safely." He then ordered his officers to secure the Hindu and keep him close prisoner, after which he retired to his palace in great affliction that the festival of the New Year should have proved so inauspicious. In the meantime, the prince was carried through the air with prodigious velocity, and in less than an hour's time had ascended so high that he could not distinguish anything on the earth, but mountains and plains seemed confounded together. It was then he began to think of returning, and conceived he might do this by turning the peg the contrary way, and pulling the bridle at the same time. But when he found that the horse still rose with the same swiftness, his alarm was great. He turned the peg several times, one way and the other, but all in vain. It was then he grew sensible of his fault in not having learnt the necessary precautions to guide the horse before he mounted. However, he examined the horse's head and neck with attention, and perceived behind the right ear another peg, smaller than the other. He turned that peg, and presently perceived that he had descended in the same manner as he had mounted, although not quite so swiftly. Night had fallen over that part of the country in which the prince found himself when at length the horse stopped upon solid earth. He was very faint from hunger, having eaten nothing since the morning when he came out of the palace with his father to assist at the festival. He found himself upon the terrace of a magnificent palace, and, groping about in the darkness, found a staircase which led down into an apartment, the door of which was half open. Few but Prince Firoz Shah would have ventured to descend those stairs, dark as it was, and expose himself to dangers from unknown foes. He was quite unarmed, but, being of a courageous disposition, he opened the door wider, without making any noise, went softly down the stairs, that he might not awaken anybody, and when he came to a landing place on the staircase, found the door of a great hall that had a light in it open. He stopped at the door, and listening, heard no other noise than the snoring of some people who were fast asleep. He advanced a little into the room, and by the light of a lamp saw that those persons were black chamberlains with naked sabres laid by them, which was enough to inform him that this was a guard chamber of some sultan or princess, which latter it proved to be. In the next room to this, the princess lay, as appeared by the light streaming through a draped doorway. Prince Firoz Shah advanced on tiptoe without waking the chamberlains. He drew aside the curtain, went in, and without staying to observe the magnificence of the chamber, gave his attention to something of greater importance. He saw many beds arranged upon the floor, and in these slept the women attendants of the princess, whilst the princess herself reposed upon a raised couch. He crept towards the bed, without waking either the princess or her women, and beheld a beauty so extraordinary that he straightway fell in love with her. But having penetrated thus far, the prince knew very well that as soon as he was discovered, he would be most certainly killed by the guards, so he resolved to enlist the sympathy of the princess. He fell on his knees beside her and gently twitched her sleeve. She opened her eyes and, seeing a handsome man on his knees, was greatly surprised, yet seemed to show no sign of fear. The prince bowed his head to the ground and rising, said, "Beautiful princess, by the most extraordinary and wonderful adventure, you see at your feet a suppliant prince, son of the Emperor of Persia, who was yesterday in his court at the celebration of a solemn festival, but is now in a strange country, in danger of his life. If you have not the goodness and generosity to afford him your assistance and protection, these I implore with the confidence that you will not refuse me, as one possessing so much beauty and majesty must be incapable of entertaining any but the most humane thoughts." "Prince," she replied courteously, "you have chanced upon no barbarous country. You are in the kingdom of Bengal, and my father, who is the Rajah, will no doubt extend to you the protection you have asked of me. But I would have you tell me," she added, "by what miracle you have come hither from the capital of Persia in so short a time, and by what enchantment you have been able to penetrate so far as to come to my apartment, and to have evaded the vigilance of my guards. Yet, as you must be sorely in need of food and rest, I will set aside my curiosity, and give orders to my women to regale you and show you an apartment, that you may rest yourself after your fatigue and be the better able to satisfy my curiosity." The princess's women, who awoke at the first words which the prince addressed to the princess, were in the utmost surprise to see a man at the princess's feet, as they could not conceive how he had come thither without waking them or the chamberlains. They no sooner comprehended the princess's intentions than they were ready to obey her commands. They each took a wax candle, of which there were great numbers, lighted up in the room, and after the prince had respectfully taken leave, went before and conducted him into a handsome chamber, where, while some were preparing the bed, others went into the kitchen, and, notwithstanding the unreasonable hour, they soon brought him a choice collation, and when he had eaten as much as he chose, they removed the trays and left him to taste the sweets of repose. In the meantime, the Princess of Bengal was so struck with the charms, wit, politeness, and other good qualities which she had discovered in her short interview with the prince, that she could not sleep. But when her women came into her room again, questioned them as to the hospitality they had shown him, and then proceeded to ask them more particularly what they thought of him. They assured her that they thought him as handsome as he appeared amiable, and that there was no other prince in Bengal to be compared to him, and that she would be happy indeed if her father were to marry her to one so suited to her in every way. The next day, the princess took more pains in dressing and attiring herself at the mirror than she had ever done before, and also tried the patience of her women beyond endurance. So anxious was she to try on and take off again the various garments she possessed, being dissatisfied with all of them. At length she was habited in a garment of the richest stuffs of the Indies, which is only made for kings, princes, and princesses. She adorned her head, arms, and waist with the finest and largest diamonds she possessed, and after she had again and again consulted her mirror, she asked her women one after another if anything was wanting in her attire. Being assured that she looked more lovely than ever, she sent to know if the Prince of Persia was awake, and, hearing that he was already up and dressed, she went immediately to pay him a visit. "I would have received you in my own apartment," she informed him, "but as the chief of my guards has leave to come so far, though no farther without my leave, I feared we might be interrupted. I therefore came to you, and beg you to gratify my curiosity as to the manner in which you came hither." Prince Firoz Shah began the recital of his story with a description of the festival of the New Year, mentioning the various inventions which had been brought to court. Then he came to the enchanted horse, and, having described it minutely, said, "You may well think, charming princess, that the emperor, my father, who cares not what he gives for anything that is rare and curious, would be very desirous to purchase such a curiosity." He asked the Hindu his price, and he replied that he would give the horse only in exchange for the princess, my sister, whom he wished to marry. The crowd of courtiers who stood about the emperor, my father, laughed loudly at the extravagance of the demand. As for me, I was the more indignant as I saw my father was inclined to consent to the proposal, so anxious was he to possess the horse. The despicable Hindu, thinking no doubt that he would bring me over to his opinion, if once I understood the singular worth of his horse, invited me to make a trial of him. To please my father, I mounted the horse, and as soon as I was upon his back, put my hand on a peg, as I had seen the Hindu do before, to make the horse mount into the air, and did not wait to receive instructions from the owner as to the way I should guide the animal. The instant I touched the peg, the horse ascended as swift as an arrow, and I was presently at such a distance from the earth that I could not distinguish any object. From the swiftness of the motion, I was for some time unapprehensive of the danger to which I was exposed. When I grew sensible of it, I endeavored to turn the peg the contrary way, but the experiment did not answer, for still the horse rose and carried me a greater distance from the earth. At last I perceived another peg, which I turned, and then I grew sensible that the horse descended towards the earth, and presently found myself so surrounded with darkness that it was impossible to guide the machine. At length the horse stopped. I alighted, and, examining my whereabouts, found myself upon the terrace of this palace. I descended the steps, and, seeing a door open, entered, passed through the room in which the guards were asleep, and entered your chamber. With what passed next, you are not unacquainted, and now I feel obliged in duty to thank you for your goodness and generosity. According to the law of nations, I am already your slave, and cannot make you an offer of my person. There only remains my heart, but alas, princess, that is no longer my own. Your charms have forced it from me, and I shall never ask for it again, but yield it up to you, and only beg for leave to declare you mistress of both my heart and inclination." The princess blushed very prettily, and replied that she had been very pleasurably entertained by the recital of the prince's wonderful adventures, declaring she could not forbear a shudder when she thought of the tremendous height he had been in the air, and avowing her delight that he had descended upon the terrace of her palace instead of in some other spot, as might very easily have happened. "As to your being my slave," said she, "I should think myself offended if you seriously believe so. Assure yourself you are here as much at liberty as in the midst of the court of Persia." At this moment, one of the princess's women announced that a meal had been served, and the princess led him into a magnificent hall, where a cloth was laid, and the table being covered with a great variety of dainty and choice dishes. Having breakfast, they rose, and the princess again conducted the prince into a large and magnificent apartment, where they sat down in a balcony overlooking the gardens of the palace. Here they conversed very pleasantly together, the prince describing his home and country, and managing to draw very flattering comparisons between the princess's beautiful palace and those in his own country. The princess, whilst assuring him that she had no complaints to make of the palace allotted to her, assured him that the one inhabited by her father, the Rajah, was far finer. She begged him, since chance had brought him so near to her father's capital, to pay him a visit there, in order that he might receive the honors due to a prince of his rank and merit. The princess hoped that, by exciting in the Prince of Persia a curiosity to see the capital of Bengal, and to visit her father, the king, seeing him so handsome, wise, and accomplished a prince, might perhaps resolve to propose an alliance with him, by offering her to him as a wife. And as she was in no wise averse to the handsome young man herself, this course would have pleased her vastly. The prince, however, did not return her answer according to her expectations. "Princess," he replied, "the preference which you gave the Rajah of Bengal's palace to your own is enough to induce me to believe it much exceeds it. And as for the proposal of my going and paying my respects to the king, your father, I should not only do myself a pleasure, but an honor. But judge, princess, yourself, would you advise me to present myself before so great a monarch like an adventurer, without attendants and a train suitable to my rank?" "Prince," replied the princess, "let not that give you any pain. If you will but go, you shall want no money to have what train and attendants you please. I will furnish you, and we have traders here of all nations in great numbers, and you may make choice of as many as you please to form your household." "I would most willingly accept this obliging offer," replied the prince, "for which, moreover, I cannot sufficiently show my gratitude if I were not prevented by the thought of the uneasiness my father must feel on account of my absence. I should be unworthy of the tenderness he has always had for me if I did not return as soon as possible to calm his fears. Afterwards, princess, if you will permit me, and think me worthy to aspire to the happiness of becoming your husband, I will obtain my father's leave to return, not as a stranger, but as a prince, to contract an alliance with your father by our marriage." The Princess of Bengal was too reasonable, after what the Prince of Persia had said, to persist any longer in persuading him to pay a visit to the Rajah of Bengal, or to ask anything of him contrary to his duty and honor. But she begged him, at least, to remain a few days longer in her palace, and so well did she entertain him, that the days had extended into months before the prince could manage to tear himself away. But at length, in declaring seriously that he could stay no longer, he entreated her to accompany him to his father's court. As the prince observed that the princess was not averse to this suggestion, he continued to urge it. "As for my father's consent, princess," he said, "I venture to assure you he will receive you with pleasure. And as for the Rajah of Bengal, after all the love and tender regard he has expressed for you, he must be the reverse of what you have described him if he should not receive in a friendly manner the embassy which my father will send to him for his approbation of our marriage." The princess returned no answer to this address, but her silence and eyes cast down were sufficient to inform him that she had no reluctance to accompany him into Persia. Her one objection was the fear that the prince might not be able to manage the enchanted horse, but on the prince's declaration that he could guide it as well as the Hindu himself, she consented to accompany him. The next morning, a little before daybreak, when all the attendants were asleep, the prince and princess went out upon the terrace of the palace. The prince turned the horse towards Persia, and placed him where the princess could easily get up behind him, which she had no sooner done, and was well seated with her arms about his waist for her better security, than he turned the peg, when the horse mounted into the air, and, making his usual haste, under the guidance of the prince, in 2 hours' time they reached the capital of Persia. He would not alight at the great square from whence he had set out, nor in the palace, but directed his course towards a pleasure house, a little distance from the capital. He led the princess into a handsome apartment, where he told her that, to do her all the honor that was due to her, he would go and inform his father of their arrival, and return to her immediately. He ordered the servants to provide her with whatever she required, and took his leave. He then ordered a horse to be saddled and set out for his father's palace. He was received with loud acclamations of joy by the people, and the emperor, his father, embraced him with tears of love and tenderness in his eyes. He was eagerly questioned as to his adventures, and inquiries were made as to the whereabouts of the Hindu's horse. He was only too anxious to relate all that had befallen him, and laid particular stress upon the kindness he had received at the hands of the Princess of Bengal, dwelt upon the love they bore to each other, and finally confessed that he had prevailed upon her to accompany him to Persia, riding with him upon the enchanted horse. "Sir," said the prince, "I feel assured you will not refuse your consent to our union, and the princess awaits your decision as anxiously as I do. She is now at the palace where your majesty often goes for your pleasure." "Son," replied the emperor, once more embracing him, "I not only consent to your marriage with the Princess of Bengal, but I will go and meet her myself, and will bring her to my palace and celebrate your nuptials this day." The emperor then gave orders for his court to make preparations for the princess's entry. The rejoicings were to be announced by the royal band of military music, and the Hindu was to be taken from his prison and brought before him. When this had been done, the emperor said, "I secured your person, that your life might answer for that of the prince, my son, whom, however, I have found again. Go, take your horse, and never let me see your face more." The Hindu had heard from those who brought him out of prison that Prince Firoz Shah had returned with a princess, and also was informed of the place where he had alighted and left her, and that the emperor was making preparations to go and bring her to his palace, and as soon as he left the emperor's presence, he bethought himself of being revenged upon the emperor and the prince. Without losing any time, he went directly to the palace, and, addressing himself to the keeper, told him he came from the Prince of Persia for the Princess of Bengal, and that he was to conduct her, seated behind him upon the enchanted horse, through the air to the emperor, who waited in the great square of his palace to gratify the whole court and city with the wonderful sight. The palace keeper, who knew the Hindu and that the emperor had imprisoned him, gave the more credit to what he said, because he saw that he had been set at liberty. He presented to him the princess, who no sooner understood that he came from the prince than she consented to do as she believed the prince desired her. The Hindu, overjoyed at his success and the ease with which he had accomplished his villainy, mounted the horse, took the princess behind him, turned the peg, and instantly the horse mounted into the air. At the same time, the emperor was on his way to the palace, and the prince rode a little in advance, that he might prepare the princess to receive his father. The Hindu, thinking this an excellent opportunity to brave them both, and revenge himself for the ill treatment he had received, appeared above their heads with his prize. When the emperor saw what had happened, he and all his courtiers assailed him with reproaches and threats, but more they could not do. It was beyond their power, and they returned to the palace overwhelmed with rage and vexation. But what was Prince Firoz Shah's grief at beholding the Hindu hurrying away the princess whom he loved so passionately? He did not know at first how he should act, but decided to at least attempt to recover the princess from the power of the wicked Hindu. He therefore continued his way to the pleasure palace where he had left the princess. The palace keeper, who knew by this time that he had been too credulous, threw himself at the prince's feet and entreated him to take his life. "Rise," said the prince. "I do not impute the loss of my princess to you, but to my own want of precaution. But lose no time. Fetch me a dervish's habit, and take care you do not give the least hint that it is for me." Not far from the pleasure palace stood a convent of dervishes, the superior of which was the palace keeper's friend, and from him he readily obtained a complete dervish's habit and carried it to Prince Firoz Shah. The prince dressed himself in it, and, being thus completely disguised, took a box of jewels which he had brought as a present for the princess, and set out upon his travels, determined not to return until he had found his princess, or to perish in the attempt. But to return to the Hindu, he managed his enchanted horse so well that he arrived early next morning in a wood near the capital of the kingdom of Kashmir. Being hungry and concluding the princess was also, he alighted in the wood and left the princess reclining on a grassy spot close to a rivulet of clear water, whilst he went in search of food. The princess would willingly have attempted to make her escape, but she was too much overcome with fear, hunger, and fatigue to move from the spot. When the Hindu returned, she took eagerly the food he gave her, for she wished to recover her strength sufficiently to be able to outwit him. Unfortunately, before long, she heard the sound of horsemen advancing, and deeming that she could not very well be in worse hands than those of the Hindu, she shrieked and cried for help. Fortunately, the company of horsemen proved to be the Sultan of Kashmir and his attendants, who, as they were returning from hunting happily for the Princess of Bengal, passed through that part of the wood and ran to her assistance. The Sultan addressed himself to the Hindu, demanded who he was, and wherefore he ill-treated the lady. The Hindu, with great impudence, replied that she was his wife, and no one had any right to interfere between them. The princess, who neither knew the rank nor the quality of the person who came so seasonably to her relief, hastened to say, "My lord, whoever you are, whom heaven has sent to my assistance, have compassion on a princess in distress, and give no credit to that impostor. Heaven forbid that I should be the wife of so vile and despicable a Hindu, a wicked magician, who has forced me away from the Prince of Persia, to whom I was going to be united, and has brought me hither on the enchanted horse you behold there." The Princess of Bengal had no occasion to say more to persuade the Sultan of Kashmir that what she told him was truth. Her beauty, majestic air, and tears spoke sufficiently for her. Justly enraged at the insolence of the Hindu, he ordered his guards to surround him and strike off his head, which sentence was immediately executed. The princess, thus delivered from the persecutions of the Hindu, fell into another no less affliction. The Sultan conducted her to his palace, where he lodged her in the most magnificent apartments, next to his own, commanded a great number of women slaves to attend her, and ordered a suitable guard. He led her himself into the apartment he had assigned her, where, without giving her time to thank him for the great obligation she had received, he said to her, "As I am certain, princess, that you must want rest, I will take my leave of you till tomorrow, when you will be better able to relate to me the circumstances of this strange adventure." He then left her. The princess's joy was inexpressible at finding herself delivered from the Hindu, and she flattered herself that the Sultan of Kashmir would complete his generosity by sending her back to the Prince of Persia, when she should have told him her story. But alas, she was deceived in her hopes, for the Sultan had fallen in love with her and had resolved to marry her the next day. For that reason, he ordered great rejoicings to be made, and the princess was awakened at daybreak by the beating of drums, and sounding of trumpets, and noise of other instruments expressive of joy. When the Sultan, who had given orders that he should be informed when the princess was ready to receive a visit, came to wait upon her, after he had inquired after her health, he acquainted her that all those rejoicings were to render their nuptials the more solemn, and at the same time desired her to assent to the union. This declaration put her into such agitation that she fainted away. The women slaves who were present ran to her assistance, and when at length she began to recover from her swoon, she resolved that, sooner than wed the Sultan and be false to the prince, she would feign madness, thereby gaining a little time in which to make plans for her escape. So she began to utter the most extravagant expressions before the Sultan, and even rose from her seat as if to attack him. He was greatly grieved, fearing that it was his sudden and unexpected proposal that had caused the attack. As his presence seemed to irritate her, he left her with her women, charging them to take the greatest care of her and never to leave her alone. He sent many times during the day to inquire after her, but the reports he received were most unfavorable. The next day, the princess was still no better, and the Sultan sent for his court physicians to ask if they could cure her. The princess, who feared if they examined her too closely, they would discover the trick she had resorted to, pretended to fly into a fit of rage and to be anxious to injure them, so that they were all afraid to approach her. Some ordered her potions, which she made no difficulty in taking, but which had no effect whatever in mitigating the disease. When the Sultan of Kashmir saw that his court physicians could not cure her, he called in others, but without effect. Then he sent messages to the courts of neighboring sultans, begging that the most famous physicians might be allowed to come and try their skill upon the case of the princess. Various physicians arrived from all parts and tried their skill, but none could boast of success, since it was a case that did not depend on medicine, but on the will of the princess herself. During this time, Prince Firoz Shah, disguised in the habit of a dervish, traveled through many provinces and towns, not knowing which way to direct his course, or whether he might not be pursuing the very opposite road to which he ought, in order to hear tidings of the lost princess. He made diligent inquiry after her at every place he came to, till at last, passing through a city of Hindustan, he heard the people talk much of a princess of Bengal, who went mad the very day of her intended marriage with the Sultan of Kashmir. At the name of the Princess of Bengal, and supposing that there could exist no other Princess of Bengal than her, upon whose account he had undertaken his travels, he hastened towards the kingdom of Kashmir, and upon his arrival at the capital, took up his lodging at a khan, where he heard the story of the princess and the fate of the Hindu magician, and felt convinced that he had at length found the beloved object of his search. The following day, he provided himself with a physician's habit, and having let his beard grow during his travels, he felt he could easily pass himself off as a physician. He went to the Sultan's palace, where he presented himself to the chief of the officers, and observed, modestly, that perhaps it might be looked upon as a rash undertaking to attempt to cure the princess after so many had failed, but that he hoped some specifics, from which he had experienced success, might effect the desired relief. The chief of the officers told him he was welcome, that the Sultan would receive him with pleasure, and that, if he should have the good fortune to restore the princess to her former health, he might expect a considerable reward from his master's liberality. The Sultan of Kashmir, who had begun to lose all hope of the princess's recovery, when he heard of the new physician's arrival, ordered him to be shown into his presence. Then, without wasting any time, he told him the princess could not bear the sight of any physicians without falling into the most violent transports, which increased her malady, and took him straightway to a little room from whence, through a lattice, he might see her without being observed. There Prince Firoz Shah beheld his lovely princess sitting with tears in her eyes, and singing an air in which she deplored her unhappy fate, which had deprived her, perhaps forever, of the object she loved so tenderly. The prince was much affected by the melancholy condition in which he found his dear princess, but he felt certain her malady was feigned for love of him, and so he told the Sultan that he had discovered the nature of the complaint, and that it was not incurable, but added that it was absolutely necessary for him to speak with her alone. The Sultan ordered the prince's door to be opened, and Prince Firoz Shah went in. As soon as the princess saw him, taking him by his habit to be a physician, she rose up in a rage, threatening and abusing him. He, however, went straight towards her and said in a low voice, that no one else might hear, "Princess, I am not a physician, but the Prince of Persia, and am come to procure your liberty." The princess, who knew the sound of the voice and the upper features of his face, notwithstanding he had let his beard grow so long, grew calm at once, and a secret joy and pleasure overspread her face. Prince Firoz Shah told her as briefly as possible how despair had seized him when he saw the Hindu carry her away, the resolution he afterwards had taken to leave everything to find her out, and never to return home till he had regained her, and by what good fortune, at last, after a long and fatiguing journey, he had the satisfaction of finding her in the palace of the Sultan of Kashmir. He then desired the princess to inform him of all that happened to her, from the time she was taken away till that moment when he had the happiness to converse with her, telling her that it was of the greatest importance to know this, that he might take the most proper measures to deliver her from the tyranny of the Sultan of Kashmir. The princess, having informed him of all that had happened, of her rescue from the Hindu and the Sultan's subsequent intention of marrying her, added that she had been able to think of no other mode of escaping than to feign madness. The prince then asked if she knew what had become of the enchanted horse. The princess, however, knew nothing of its whereabouts, but was quite sure that the Sultan had preserved it as a great curiosity. As Prince Firoz Shah never doubted but the Sultan had the horse, he told the princess that he intended making use of it to convey them both back to Persia, and after they had consulted together on the measures they should take, they agreed that the princess should dress herself the next day and receive the Sultan civilly, but without speaking to him. The Sultan was overjoyed when the prince stated to him the effect his first visit had had towards the cure of the princess. On the following day, when the princess received him in such a manner as persuaded him her cure was far advanced, he regarded him as the greatest physician in the world, and, seeing her in this state, contented himself with telling her how rejoiced he was at her being likely soon to recover her health. He bade her follow the directions of so skillful a physician in order to complete what he had so well begun, and then retired without waiting for her answer. The Prince of Persia asked the Sultan how the Princess of Bengal came into the dominions of Kashmir thus alone, since her own country was very far distant. This he said on purpose to introduce some conversation about the enchanted horse, and to find out what had become of it. The Sultan, who could not penetrate into the prince's motive, concealed nothing from him, and told him that he had ordered the enchanted horse to be kept in his treasury as a great curiosity, though he knew not the way to use it. "Sir," replied the pretended physician, "the information which your majesty has given your devoted slave affords me a means of curing the princess. As she was brought hither on this horse, and the horse is enchanted, she has contracted something of the enchantment, which can be dissipated only by a certain incense, which I am acquainted with. If your majesty would entertain yourself, your court, and the people of your capital with the most surprising sight that ever was beheld, let the horse be brought into the great square before the palace, and leave the rest to me. I promise to show you and all that assemble, in a few moments' time, the Princess of Bengal, completely restored in body and mind. But the better to effect what I propose, it will be requisite that the princess should be dressed as magnificently as possible, and adorned with the most valuable jewels your majesty may possess." The Sultan, having eagerly consented to all that was asked of him, preparations were made for the show to take place upon the following day. In the morning, by the prince's orders, the horse was taken out of the treasury and placed in the great square before the palace. A report having been spread through the town that there was something wonderful to be seen, crowds of people flocked from all parts, insomuch that the Sultan's guards were placed around the horse to prevent disorder and to keep a space clear. The Sultan of Kashmir, surrounded by all his nobles and ministers of state, was seated upon a platform erected for the purpose. The Princess of Bengal, attended by a number of ladies whom the Sultan had assigned her, went up to the enchanted horse and mounted with the help of her women. When she was in the saddle and had the bridle in her hand, the pretended physician placed round the horse at a proper distance many vessels full of lighted charcoal, which he had ordered to be brought, and going round them with a solemn pace, cast in a strong and sweet-smelling perfume. Then, with downcast eyes and his hands crossed upon his breast, he paced 3 times round the horse, pronouncing some mystical words. The moment the pots of charcoal sent forth a dense cloud which surrounded the princess so that neither she nor the horse could be seen, the prince jumped nimbly up behind her, and reaching his hand to the peg, turned it, and just as the horse rose in the air, he pronounced these words, which the Sultan heard distinctly: "Sultan of Kashmir, when you marry princesses who implore your protection, learn first to obtain their consent." Thus the prince delivered the Princess of Bengal and carried her the same day to the capital of Persia, where he alighted in the square before the palace. The emperor, his father, ordered every preparation for the solemnization of their marriage to be made immediately, and the ceremony was performed with due pomp and magnificence. After the days appointed for the rejoicings were over, the Emperor of Persia's first care was to name and appoint an ambassador to go to the Rajah of Bengal with an account of what had happened, and to demand his approbation and ratification of the alliance contracted by this marriage, which the Rajah of Bengal took as an honor and granted with great pleasure and satisfaction. The end. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this reading and/or would like to hear more, please consider subscribing to my channel and hit the bell to receive notifications of any new readings that I upload. Thanks for all your support, and see you next time.